the Honorable Minister Edu's chairmanship, has chosen the right focus at the right time. Trade within the continent as well as with the rest of the world has a crucial role to play in accelerating sustainable economic growth across Africa. As we know, the global economic context is difficult. Despite the resilience they have shown in the face of recent shocks, many African economies are struggling to cope with tight financing, high borrowing costs, and debt pressures. A few weeks ago, the IMF lowered its 2024 growth forecast for sub-Saharan Africa by 0.4 percentage points to 3.7%, mainly due to a 0.2 percentage point downward revision to the growth outlook in Nigeria after the first quarter. The forecast for next year is 4.4%, still below the average for emerging markets and developing economies. More trade and value addition are necessary to create the better jobs that our young people urgently need. Greater regional economic integration will contribute directly to these ends. In addition, the large and unified market of 1.4 billion people, represented by the African Continental Free Trade Area, will help turn the continent into a stronger base for producing for global markets and for attracting investment, including from other African and developing economies. This would help African economies sustain higher growth and foreign exchange earnings in the years ahead. But the road ahead is long. According to UN data for 2021, only 13% of Africa's goods trade was intra-regional, compared to 21% for Southeast Asia, 39% for the US, Mexico and Canada, and 60% for the European Union. Africa accounts for only about 3% of global goods trade and an even lower proportion of global services trade. To realize the full potential of intra-African trade integration to drive growth, we need to lower trade costs across the continent, and that is why the Africa Caucus's focus on facilitating intra-African trade is so timely. Estimates by WTO economists suggest that African businesses currently face trade costs equivalent to a 354% tariff, which is among the world's steepest, and 1.5 times the level in high-income countries. For intra-African trade, the costs are 1/5 higher, equivalent to a 435% tariff. IMF research estimates that implementing the reductions to tariff and non-tariff barriers foreseen in the African Continental Free Trade Area would increase the median merchandise trade flow between African countries by 15% and boost median low per capita GDP by 1.2%. The projected gains become even bigger if accompanied by improvements in the trade environment, for instance, to transport and telecommunications infrastructure, access to finance, and domestic security. Median merchandise trade flows among African countries could rise by 53% and trade with the rest of the world by 15%. The per capita real GDP of the median African country would rise by more than 10%, putting a serious dent in extreme poverty. Implementing the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement and the new Agreement on Investment Facilitation for Development would help African countries create a more supportive environment for intra-African trade and investment. The WTO is also working with the World Bank to improve digital infrastructure in several African countries. The bank is bringing funding for building out the hard infrastructure, while we are bringing expertise for the soft infrastructure, that is, the regulatory side. Another set of reforms deals with labor mobility. I hear anecdotes suggesting that even the continent's biggest businessmen like Aliko Dangote, struggle with visa requirements when doing business across Africa. For smaller businesses, the obstacles are frequently insurmountable. With effective trade reforms, I believe the continent could be poised for an era of stronger and more sustainable growth, with regional and global trade playing important propulsive roles. Let me give you 3 reasons why. First, in an aging world, Africa's growing young population offers the workforce and the markets of tomorrow. Second, even as goods trade has slowed down, services remains a bright spot in global trade, especially services traded digitally over computer networks, digitally delivered services. These sectors allow the continent's tech-savvy young entrepreneurs to leapfrog bad roads and ports, provided hard and soft digital infrastructure are good enough. And third, the current push for supply chain diversification in the wake of pandemic and other disruptions creates a window of opportunity for greater investment in Africa. More investment on the continent for regional, continental, and global value chains would deconcentrate the production of key supplies, making production and diffusion more resilient. At the WTO, we are calling this process re-globalization, and I want you to retain that word, re-globalization. We believe it can simultaneously help boost growth, job creation, and supply resilience. We are already seeing re-globalization happen as companies ask suppliers to reduce costs and diversify risks by installing production facilities in places like Vietnam. But instead of making this a +1 process, that is China +1, China plus Vietnam, or China plus India, we need investment to spread further, say to include countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Morocco, Rwanda, and so on. Why not? These dynamics are bolstered by Africa's abundant green energy potential, which makes the continent an attractive destination for investment in energy-intensive sectors, including the production of green hydrogen. In fact, we have already seen Microsoft and G42, the UAE's top artificial intelligence firm, join forces on building a $1 billion data center in Kenya, powered by geothermal energy. There is much more scope for Africa to leverage such green comparative advantage, where countries specialize in what they are relatively green at. The low carbon transition and related demand for necessary critical minerals offer opportunities for African countries to attract investment to build up processing facilities locally. This would create jobs on the continent whilst helping to mitigate the risk of global supply bottlenecks arising from the current high degree of concentration in critical minerals processing. If processing can be powered by green hydrogen, the environmental dividends will be even greater. And African youth will be gainfully employed in Africa rather than risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean trying to get to Europe. Excellencies, let me now conclude. The Africa Caucus is well positioned to champion macroeconomic reform across the continent, serving as a bridge between the IMF and the World Bank and African governments. At this meeting, you have assembled the full panoply of actors needed to make a serious push to facilitate intra-African trade. Doing so would unleash the power of trade to grow the African economy and improve the lives of people across the continent. I wish you well in your efforts and want to assure you that the WTO Secretariat and I stand ready to assist you in any way we can. Have a good meeting and thank you.